The presentation that follows was made online to a group of residents of Scampton on 26th of October 2020. Well, good evening again, and I'll explain now what it is we've been doing. Our job, as I say, working alongside community links who are looking at all sorts of community development aspects and looking at governance arrangements and how that all could fit together for the future. Our job is really to look at the physical side of it, but relating that to the community and the community's needs and aspirations and what may be happening sometime in the future when the RAF move out. And we think that will be at the end of 2022, but there's still some uncertainty about exactly what happens at that stage and whether any part of it is retained. We know that there's still at this stage expectations that the red arrows will be flying over Scampton. We're not quite sure what the implications are of that for the ground facilities. So there's, as I say, there's uncertainties, and we're focusing particularly on the estate, the residential parts, and how they can be transformed, what's necessary to support the things that people value and to maintain the things that people value. So what we're producing is called a placemaking framework. I'll explain what that is in a bit of detail, or it'll become clear, I think, as we go through. But if you want a definition of placemaking, the one that we use is that. It's about making places or supporting places that themselves support the well-being of the people whose lives connect in them and with them. And that's now and into the future. And the future obviously is important because we're planning for the future. The future is also very uncertain for all sorts of reasons at the moment. So we'll be referring to that and probably discussing that a bit later on. So we know, as I said, that the RAF will be decommissioning. We're not quite sure the extent of that, so that's a bit of uncertainty, particularly regarding the red arrows. The whole context for everything that we do really has some uncertainties about it. I suppose it always does, but it's just that we know that there are a lot of uncertainties. Perhaps a lot of the time we don't know how uncertain things are, but at the moment we do know that some things, we're certain that they're happening, but we're not certain what their effects are going to be. Climate change is obviously a big one for any exercise that's looking at the future of places, whether that means a country, a continent, or a village. The current situation with the COVID pandemic is clearly continuing to be uncertain. We've heard the news about Nottinghamshire this evening. Clearly things are going to be changing, evolving over several months to come. And we don't really know quite what the longer term effects of that will be. Coupled with those other things, one is climate change, the other is the one below it, technology. We know that climate change is having impacts and that things are adapting. We know that there were already technological changes and adaptations that were starting to have big effects. So, for instance, transport, telecommunications, the relationship between those things and where we live and where we work, that was already starting to change. And the pandemic and the responses to it have probably accelerated some of those changes. So again, we can look at those, they'll crop up in what I'm going to say, and we can perhaps talk about some of those later in the context of Scampton. One thing that we have recognised right from the start, and it's really why we're doing the job, is that the things that go to make a military base aren't necessarily the things that go to make a civilian place. So a normal village isn't structured and arranged in the same way than an RAF basis. And that has some fairly deep-rooted effects. And just want to sort of explain some of that as over the next few slides, just to show you the context for what we're doing. Before I do that, I'll just explain that that's why we're doing the job, because this sort of exercise, this sort of planning, hasn't taken place previously with the closure of other RAF bases in Lincolnshire, generally other RAF bases across the country. So if, for instance, you look just up the A15, Hemswell Cliff, there was really no planning at the time that closed. The land was disposed of in a very piecemeal way, no strategy for the future. And West Lindsey District Council, Hemswell Cliff Parish Council, more particularly the communities, both the business community and the residential community at Hemswell Cliff, are still really trying to sort out the problems that have resulted from that. So a key part of what we're doing is to try to find ways of avoiding repetition of that sort of problem, those sort of issues, as things change at Scampton. So some of the reasons why what's good for a military base isn't good for a village necessarily. To start with, just the location. The military bases, the airfields across Lincolnshire were generally quite isolated, quite dispersed. Good reasons for that. It's all about sort of making sure that if something got attacked, you didn't lose everything at once. But that concept of isolation and dispersal is probably not ideal for a village or for the relationship between villages and between villages and the city. So there's an issue there. That dispersal affected the layout internally as well for exactly the same reason. So it's quite good to spread things about, but that means that actually there's quite substantial distances between parts of the settled area or the developed area. And again, it's probably a lot less compact than you would expect. It is, I mean, if you're looking at the, I'm hoping you can see my cursor, but if you look at the sort of the compactness of Scampton Old Village compared with the more dispersed form of the RAF development, there's a significant contrast. The military bases were meant to be at least capable of operating in a very self-contained way. Security was a significant consideration, obviously, and they needed to be able to function independently if necessary. They were also segregated internally, so the operational activities were spread out and separated from the residential parts, and then within the residential parts there was quite clear differentiation, for instance, between officers' quarters and airmen's families' quarters, and it was intended in part to sort of reflect and reinforce military hierarchy and discipline, and it was just the way that the whole thing was conceived. But it's not necessarily what you'd expect with a normal settlement. And they were designed to be excluding. I was going to say exclusive, but exclusive has multiple meanings, but they were designed to exclude. And again, there was a good reason for that, but again, it's not perhaps what you'd want to do with a normal village. The layout and the maintenance was quite uniform, and again, for good reasons, partly to sort of reinforce the conformity, partly to minimise costs, economies of scale, and just because there was a standard approach that was applied to things. But then we've seen that when that is simply broken up without thought, as it has been at Hemswell Cliff, for instance, and other places, it doesn't work so well when you get away from that uniformity as far as the management of it is concerned. Which is, I've jumped ahead a bit, but that's basically what we're saying there. It's a lot easier to manage one of these things when you've got single ownership, it's all regulated, and maintenance is clearly resting with one organisation. So just summing all that up, looking at the sort of the compatibility of the two approaches. So as you see, isolation and dispersal compared with connectivity and concentration, which what you expect of a sustainable place, they're basically not compatible. Looking at design of the place, the layout, self-containment is actually quite compatible in some ways with something that you would expect and you'd actually want to achieve, probably increasingly with the way things are going. And I'm thinking there both about the lessons of the pandemic and the lessons or the adaptations that we know need to be made in relation to climate change impacts. So self-sufficiency is probably a good thing. And so there's a built-in advantage perhaps there, although the connectivity part of it with the rest of the county and particularly Lincoln area is an issue to be looked at. Segregation is normal for an airbase. A normal village is integrated, and it's normally thought that the more integrated a community or a place is, the better it functions, generally speaking. Dispersal is probably less of a benefit for a village than a degree of concentration, because you actually want to be able to reach everything conveniently, and so you want to avoid spreading things out too much. Generally, you don't want to be too exclusive. You want to include people, and you want to make the place inclusive for people from outside as well as inside. So again, those don't really fit together too well. And you probably want to be more diverse in a sustainable place, diverse socially, diverse ecologically, if you like, biodiversity, and diverse perhaps in the form of the place, and rather less uniform. Although there are aspects of the uniformity of the layout, which, as you'll see, as I'll explain as we go on, are something that you probably want to retain. When it comes down to management, I think I've already really covered this, but that sort of single ownership regulation and centralised responsibilities doesn't fit with the current reality, but you might hope that it can actually be recreated in some way in the future of Scampton Estate. But that is a thing that hasn't worked quickly and hasn't even been achieved yet in other places. And again, I'm going to use Hemswell Cliff as the example. So of those, it's really the self-sufficiency part that is sort of the trump card, if you'll pardon the expression, the trump card in this context, because it does mean that there's a fundamental part of the DNA, if you like, of Scampton Estate that can be used as a significant strength moving forward. Okay, that's sort of the background of where we're coming from, and I think it's important to have explained that to really show why a placemaking framework is necessary and why the places where it hasn't happened haven't worked, the transition hasn't worked as well as we might like it. And that's what everybody wants to avoid repetition of over the next few years in Scampton. This is part of community engagement. What we're doing this evening, what we did last week with a couple of smaller sessions that we had then, I'm sure this would be ongoing. These are all parts of basically engaging you as the community in the planning of your community's future. And unless that happens, then it's unlikely that a satisfactory result is going to be achieved. So this is absolutely crucial to the whole thing. It's part of an ongoing process that started back in February with a questionnaire with a very good return rate. And that gave us some useful insights into how the community, probably some of you, but the community as a whole, I don't think there's 52% here this evening. So how the community as a whole felt about a range of subjects. and it helped us to identify some particular issues and topics from a placemaking and sort of forward planning point of view that really need to be picked up. Those included concerns about access, and that embraces all aspects of access. So it's partly to do with cars. Some people felt it was perhaps too dependent on cars. Some people felt it was too difficult getting in and out of the place with a car, with a single access point. Certainly concern about public transport, not a very good service, not a good option. Cycling, walkability, both between the estate and Scampton Village and Lincoln. So walking and cycling could be better provided for in that sense. But also within the estate, and as I say, that the particular one between the estate and the village. But even within the estate, some of the routes aren't as convenient as you might like, and that's something we're going to be making recommendations about. Concern about infrastructure, the roads, the drains, the street lights, the footpaths, the maintenance of them, the future of them, the future of the whole place in that context. So what happens next? What will happen on the base itself, the operational parts, if that all becomes available for alternative uses, what will they be? What will the impact on the residential parts be? Some of those questions we're not going to be able to answer in detail because we just don't know at the moment, but we've got to make some educated guesses, if you like, and sort of conceive some scenarios and think about how that might affect the way that the residential parts are developed and planned and maintained in future. Particular concern about the community facilities in that case. And I think most people recognise that actually the level of community facility for the population on Scampton Estate is much higher than is the case for settlements of a similar size in most of the rest of the county. So there's something there again that's a really good thing, but concern about, well, what happens when the RAF go? How will that be maintained? So, as I say, concerns about the future, and then uncertainty about the governance of the future, how people continue to to influence and respond to change in their communities. Going back to this issue about maintenance responsibilities and the importance of that, we've tried to map as closely as we can the patterns of maintenance management responsibilities and land ownership. I'm just going to ask my colleague John just to perhaps comment on what we've found so far and whether we still need to find out more detail. And it might be that you want to come back to this in questions and point out to anything we've got wrong. John, are you able to just...
I'll speak.
Which one do you want?
Probably just management one would be best to start on with. So ever since we really started looking at this in February of the start of this year, obviously looking at Hemsall Cliff and other ex-RAF bases, the management and ownership of properties in the ex-RAF bases is something it's a total piecemeal, and it's something that was really badly managed when the RAF bases were closed. And so it's something that we really wanted to get a clear understanding about actually which companies and who manages the spaces. It can be properties, but most likely will be the roads, common green verges, all that sort of stuff, street lighting, because obviously most places the county council or the district council will manage those spaces, or the parish councils, particularly the roads. The county council will have management of the roads and take responsibility of them. However, due to being, as Steve was talking about earlier, a centralised management area that's sort of apart from the county council, this means that this isn't the case. So that's the land management map, as you can see there. We think we've got quite a clear picture on it. Obviously, there might be some of you in the Zoom call that can add some further depth onto it. So if you just Steve, you can just do the next slide for me, please.
Okay.
Thank you. And as you can see, the land ownership map is probably the one that we least know about. Obviously, we understand we understand about the DIO and the military accommodation. We understand the private ownership parts and the county way management parts. The real area that we're not quite sure about is the purple and the gold area, which we've put as a gold shareholder. Now, in discussions with West Lindsey and previous consultation meetings earlier this year and previous weeks, people have sort of come forward about how they do own the house, but however, there's still some relationship to Addington Holdings and the current RAF base. So if anyone who lives in the gold area or the purple areas or knows anyone who lives there and can give a better idea about what the current relationship is for the land ownership and what's your ownership of the green spaces around it or anything like that, that would be really, really useful. And I think that's pretty much about it. But obviously, when Steve finishes the presentation, we'll probably go into an open discussion. If people can add to the conversation and you know, tell your own story about the ownership or management situation, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Okay, Janet, is there anything you wanted to say about the work you're doing relating to sort of governance and stuff yet, or not?
Steve, I'll wait until you've come
That's
to
fine.
the end, I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll continue. I notice some people are usefully typing into the chat part of it. Please do feel free to do that. It's really helpful if you've got comments to put them in there. Can't guarantee to read them all before we finish, but we can keep those. And so if there's things you want to say in that form, you know, just add to them as we go along. We'll have a complete record of those. So we're still looking at the issues. I say there's whole issues of government. There's issues about you know how the community is going to basically have control and influence over what happens in the future. So that's a whole stream of work in itself. There's also the fact that whatever is planned for Scampton's future as a, you know, as a brownfield site, if you like, with the airbase, Scampton's future as a community with the estate, it's not sitting in a vacuum. So at this moment in time, the local plan for the area, the local plan for central Lincolnshire, which, as a lot of you will probably know, is basically West Lindsey, City of Lincoln and North Kesteven together. That's being reviewed fairly soon. Some of the initial expectations on which the local plan will be built will be put out for discussion, and that includes house development numbers and all sorts of things. So whilst this exercise is really focusing on making an even more sustainable place of Scampton Estate as it is, it can't be entirely divorced from what the councils need to provide for in the planning of the wider area. So they do have to look at places where housing can be built, and this is one of the areas where they need to look at that and decide whether there is scope, and if so, how much, and what will be beneficial and what will be harmful. They need to look at business development areas as well. And again, if you look at the other RAF bases, sort of traditionally, that's been one of the after uses once the RAF has moved out. So again, that needs to be considered in that broader strategic context as well. So I'm just mentioning that because in a way, this is a sort of iterative process with the plans for Scampton feeding into that, but that local plan also affecting the thinking on the plans for Scampton. And I've already mentioned these wider issues, and the two big ones at the moment, climate change and the pandemic, with the fundamental changes to thinking on planning and placemaking and development that those are bringing about, the changing relationship between home and work and travelling to home and work, travelling between the two, the increasing emphasis on a degree of self-containment in communities, the move to new forms of energy, importance of diversity, circularity in the economy rather than use once and throw away. So some big changes there that were happening anyway, that are accelerated probably by responses to COVID, and that need to be taken into account in the planning of anywhere, and Scampton's no exception to that. So building on that, one of the big areas of interest at the moment is something that has various names, but the most popular one is this idea of the 15-minute city or the 15-minute neighbourhood.